Welcome to Living Well with MS Coffee Break. I'm your host Jeff Alex. We decided to do something a little different in expanding the range of content we produce here at Living Well with MS. Since our community forms the beating heart of overcoming MS, we are commencing this special series called Coffee Break, which features short interviews with members of the OMS community talking about their personal journeys adopting and staying on the OMS 7-step recovery program, the challenges they encountered and how they overcame them, and their tips and tricks for sticking to the path that leads to better health. We hope you enjoy and learn from these brief chats between our regular episodes, and as always, your comments and suggestions are welcome by emailing podcast@overcomingms.org. That's podcast@overcomingms.org. And don't forget, if you enjoy these and other Living Well with MS podcast episodes, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favourite podcast listening platform. Joining us on this episode of the Living Well with MS Coffee Break is Roy Bartlett from New Zealand. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, your life, where you live, and anything about yourself that you'd like to share, Roy?
Yeah, I live at a place called Papamoa Beach in the Western Bay of Plenty with my wife Julie. We have been together for about 25 years and we have 3 adult children and 3 grandsons, and the grandsons are all boys, and we have 2 sons and a daughter. I originally grew up in England and moved to New Zealand in 1971. I spent the first half of my working life as an engineer, and then around mid-80s I made a midlife career change, and I became a member of a family therapy team at the Glenburn Centre in Auckland, and it was a special facility for working with residential facility for working with family therapy with children who had particularly challenging behaviours. So that was a great experience. And I guess I've been on a personal journey of recovery since about 1980, because I had a pretty traumatic experience that year, and a week later I ended up with blurred vision, which wasn't picked up at the time, but I was told later when I was diagnosed was my first experience of MS being optic neuritis. So that was my wake-up call to start looking at, getting myself in a better shape as a human being, I guess. And so I've been on a road from recovery from that, and I guess the 1980s and the early 90s were pretty rocky, but it's been pretty good since then.
So when were you diagnosed with MS, and how long have you been following the OMS recovery program?
Well, I was diagnosed in 1988, and story to that is the hospital actually sent me to Sydney to go on an MRI because there wasn't an MRI in the country at that time. And I'd been suffering symptoms, and I was getting so frustrated because the neurologist would not give me any clue of what might be wrong with me. And I found that quite challenging to live with. So to get on the plane to Sydney, he gave me a letter to deliver to the MRI centre and hand over to the receptionist when I arrived. So I steamed the letter open, and it said, please check this person out for lesions on the brain, strongly suspect MS. And so I had 3 days in Sydney. I had the scans, then I had to bring the photos back with another sealed letter, which I steamed open, which actually said, yes, there are lesions on the brain. This definitely looks like multiple sclerosis. So I came back and I had to take the photos back to see the neurologist, and he read the letter, put the photos up on his little screen on the wall, then turned around to me in his very austere voice and said, "Oh, well, Roy, my team and I will have to study these, make an appointment a week, and then we'll be able to give you a diagnosis." So I was not endured with the neurologist. I found that very, 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 very hard to keep my control at the time and walk out, say thank you and walk out. But I actually knew a field worker for the MS Society who through another organisation I was involved in. So I got hold of her and she came and saw me and gave me stuff to read. And so I was pretty pleased to find all that stuff out, because last I knew what I was dealing with, after 18 months of worrying about what it could be or what it couldn't be, I actually had something I could actually deal with. And through my therapy I used my skills there. I made an assessment of assessing how much control did I have over the symptoms of MS and how much did the symptoms have over me. It was 20 for me and 80 for them, and that was the benchmark I sent to measure my progress from then on in. And the first thing I realised from reading about MS was I'd probably be my own worst enemy, in that when I'd had a relapse, I never actually allowed myself to get back to remission, with a big mortgage and kids and everything else. I would get back into working, and I could see that I just had a relapse on a relapse on a relapse on a relapse until about 3 weeks before I went to Aussie. I'd had to give up work altogether. So so I decided I'd manage with the symptoms rather than just sit back and wait for another relapse. And with looking at trying to starting to manage my fatigue, within 4 months I got back into the workforce in a 20-hour week part-time position. So that was great, and I could see as I went through the years I was getting 70-80% control over the symptoms, and my life was pretty good, really. And then in 2000 I had 2 relapses in a year, and a friend of mine came to see me who had been to a clinic in Mexico which had cured his cancer after he'd been given the death sentence in Auckland, and said he'd inquired whether they had a treatment for MS, which they had, and he sent me over there, and I decided to go. Julie and I decided to go, and I started this treatment about the same time that I first come across George Jeleniek's book back in 2001, Managing MS. So I started on the treatment. I read George's book and I thought, God, I could have wrote half of the stuff in this book from my experience of what I'd learned over the years. And but this treatment proved to be amazing. I was only the 6th person with MS in the clinic that was put on it, but my symptoms just disappeared. Within 3 months I felt so much better, and within 12 months it was like I was feeling like I was 90% in control of my body. So I kept on that treatment until 2010, and then the cost of going to Mexico every year and the treatment, I couldn't sustain it any longer. And in that year, MS symptoms started to flare up again. So that's when I went on the retreat in New Zealand with George in the 2011, and I've been on the program ever since.
And what was the treatment in Mexico that you had?
It was that they actually it was a holistic homeopathic treatment in which they drew my blood, knowing that the antibodies that attack the immune system were in the blood, and they cultured that so that then made a vaccine and some oral drops. And my wife used to inject me every week, and the vaccine acted as an anti-antibody, so it used to knock out the rogue antibodies that were attacking my myelin sheath. So it was a very new treatment, and come out of Germany, and the person who it was a chemist who was actually in charge of my treatment. I used to go and see the doctor there, and they would give me the full once over, and then send me off to the chemist, and each time I went they would draw new blood out and keep it for the year when I come back, and I had to let them know 6 weeks before I was coming back, and they'd make up the new serum from the blood they held back. So it was great treatment because it had no side effects as well. So it was made, it was a vaccine made from my own blood.
So how long have you been following the Overcoming MS program?
Well, it's a bit of a story, really. From that my diagnosis, my first step was to decide, once I'd read stuff about what MS was, that I would manage living with the symptoms rather than just cope with any sort of relapses that they happen to crop up. And I made a self-assessment at that time that I had about 20% control over the symptoms of MS, and MS had about 80% control over me. And what I realised from what the literature I read that what had happened for me, I'd had a relapse, and before I ever got into remission, if you like, as I started to get probably 70% back to normal, because of a big mortgage and kids and whatever, I would get back in to work, and I'd have a relapse on a relapse. So I never actually come into remission. I just sort of relapsed on a relapse. And about 3 weeks before I went to Sydney, I had to give up work altogether. I was struggling to walk, across the room. So I went from there, taking that approach. The second thing was to manage my fatigue. And 4 months later, I managed to get back into the workforce in a job part-time, 20 hours a week. So, that's where I started. And it wasn't until 2011 that I actually started on the OMS program. But I had known about George's work all way back at the beginning of the year 2000. I'd come across his first book, Managing MS. And I actually, 3 years later, I actually met Gary McMahon for the first time when he came to New Zealand, and he became manager of the Auckland MS Society. And I was the person who actually introduced Gary I introduced him to the book and suggested that he get George over to New Zealand and have him talk to the membership. So that's how George and Gary got to meet.
Right, so you're actually quite key to the history of OMS.
So, and we know the story from there. 9 years later, Gary resigned his position after running about 7 retreats in New Zealand and went back to become CEO of OMS.
And so what's your favourite thing about the OMS program, and what do you feel has made the biggest positive impact for you?
Well, I think overall, the program is what I call a total package. What I mean by that is, it provided me with a framework and a structure from which to explore all the, whether it's the biological, the psychological, or social factors, physical factors that determine the cause, the manifestation, and of the disease, and also of wellness. So it gave me that whole structure to hang everything on and keep me focused. And at the time, I had a mantra that I'd had for a number of years was, I'm at my best when I'm a learner. And so the program gave me plenty to learn once more. And I guess, I've been on the program. I went on a retreat in 2011 in New Zealand with George, and now I've been on the program since then. And I guess, the program is again another thing that's kept my life moving forward.
And is there anything you found difficult to adopt in the OMS program?
No, not really, because I was already on a vegan diet. I follow a spiritual path, which meditation is part of. So yeah, there was not a lot, and I don't, I hadn't drunk alcohol or smoked for about 20 years. So those sort of things, it didn't, became easy to me. So no, not really. I think, I just sort of just moved into it, and at the time I actually, in my coming back, that's right. What I discovered from the book that I collected at the retreat, there was a GP in Auckland who'd written a endorsement for the program. She had MS herself. So the one thing that I did was I changed my doctor and went and enrolled in her practice. So that was, it was a really great relationship to have a doctor with him with MS and who had gone through the program herself.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are quite familiar with their GP knowing less about their condition than they do. And I think if you've got a good doctor, they actually understand that. And my doctor's very much open about that. And he knows he's a generalist; he has to cover everything. But having a doctor with MS who's following OMS would be fantastic. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, we used to have some good conversations.
And I know you're quite active in the OMS community, and you're the ambassador of the Auckland Circle in New Zealand. So could you tell us a bit about that community and how that's changed your journey?
Yeah, I guess being part of the community, I guess it's the collective wisdom and creativity of its membership, really, of all the members. It's like some of the ways that they get to overcome some of their challenges. That's been quite inspiring, and it's just that motivation that you get from being with a group of like-minded people who are all on the same journey, wanting to live a better and healthier life. And I think the third part is knowing that you've got that group there who are really rooting for you if you have to go through a rough patch.
And how have you had to adapt your daily healthy habits to the new realities imposed by COVID-19?
When COVID broke out back in early March, earlier this year, because I'm 73 years of age and I have a compromised immune system, Julie and I decided that we would enter level 4 2 weeks before the government actually put the whole country on level 4, and then when we came down to level 3, we stayed on level 4 for a further 2 weeks, and then went down to level 3, and then when we went down to level 2, we followed that same process.
So just to explain to people around the world, level 4 in New Zealand, is that a complete lockdown?
Living in your house, no work, just you're allowed to leave your house to exercise, for a walk. Level 3, you can leave the house. You can't have a group of more than 10 people. Level 2 is you can only travel so far from your house. Level 2, you can travel. You can travel basically where you like, and you can gather up to 100 people. So those are the sort of the major implications. So we've always kept on giving ourselves 2 weeks extra protection, if you like, before venturing out to the more freedom. And of course, after 3 months where we didn't have a case, and then a family of 4 got infected in Auckland, and immediately the government stuck Auckland on level 3 and the rest of the country on level 2. Well, where we live, we could have just gone to level 2, but we went on to level 3 because we just wanted to make sure we did everything possible we could not to take a risk. But apart from that, we kept to our regular routines, and probably the greatest fun of lockdown was creating some new ones. We started having candlelit dinners. We got into online shopping, which we decided, well, why do we ever want to drive and go in the shopping centre again? We had music evenings, had Zoom meetings with friends from America, Sweden, UK, Switzerland, and then same around with people around New Zealand. We would either Skype or Zoom and telephone. So the other thing I think was being in a new home. We've been doing little projects inside the house and outside in the garden, getting the garden established and so on. And the other thing is I started writing my autobiography. So that, it's been pretty busy.
And do you have any other tips or tricks that you could share with our audience that might help them on their journeys?
Yeah, I think firstly, when someone receives a diagnosis, they need to understand it's a natural, healthy thing to grieve the loss of whatever they perceive, the diagnosis is dealing to them, if you like. But it's also equally important for them to know and understand and believe that despite that, they can go on to build a healthy life that has meaning for them. So give you an example. Back in the early 90s, I was invited by the Auckland Society to speak to newly diagnosed groups of people with MS. And I always used to start my talk off with the same opening statement, which was, let me see, how did it go? Before I was diagnosed with the symptoms of MS, I used to be able to do 1,001 things in my life, and now I can only do 999. And the difference is that 275 of the 999 things I do now are completely new and different from what I did before. And some of those 275 are things that I used to do that I couldn't do until I asked myself the question, Roy, how now can you do this differently than what you did before so you can get the same satisfaction? So I learned new ways of getting the same outcomes of what I was getting before. Life to me was more exciting now than it was before I was diagnosed with MS. And that used to be my opening statement, and then we go on from there and answer their questions or whatever.
That's an excellent way of looking at it, I think.
Yeah, and I guess, that's one of the things of the OMS website. There are so many positive, motivating stories of how people have changed their lives in positive ways. They're an inspiration to us all.
And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us on this episode of the Living Well with MS Coffee Break. Roy Bartlett.